So anyway, that would be, so there was the sense that the foreign presence was really driving the violence. Now, some people would say that's true in Afghanistan, obviously. And that's part of why I do not ultimately critique President Obama for the July 2011 deadline as strongly as many people. I probably would not have favored it if I was one of the people advising him, but I see a lot of potential upsides. I think it's a very close judgment call whether the upsides are worth the downsides. But I think the basic notion of saying we have a strategy to leave is worth saying in these places, even if it's going to take you 2, 3, 4 years to achieve that strategy, because it at least helps diplomats and Afghan friends and others, even though it's a difficult argument to persuade people that you're sincere, it at least gives you an argument to say this is our 3-year plan. Now, General Petraeus in his confirmation hearings and others in the Obama administration, they don't ever want to say how long they think it will take. I'm trying to write an article right now where I try to sketch out how long I think it will take, because if the government doesn't want to say so, I think, Afghans at least are entitled to some estimate of how long we think it will be before we can mostly get out or get down to Peter's numbers of 15,000. And I think it'll be about 3 years. I think it's worth saying, because there is, again, this concern that the very presence that we have can drive the violence. So that probably doesn't answer all of your questions, but it's an effort to explain sort of how these different arguments came out of the same end.
So do we have Peter, a moral and historical obligation to Afghanistan as well as a strategic one?
Well, the first point is, regardless of the morality of it, if the strategy isn't going to work, it isn't worth doing. Regardless of the moral obligation that one might feel, and there probably is some. And to reiterate, Michael's appealed for time for a U.S. military strategy. He has not explained how Hamid Karzai or this government is going to be able to address any of the points I made. How is it going to become legitimate? How is it going to become less corrupt? How is it going to become more effective? In fact, the situation in Afghanistan is certain to get worse. And the reason it's going to get worse is September, parliamentary elections. Unbelievably, the United Nations, with the tacit support of the Obama administration, has agreed to let Karzai have more control over the electoral machinery in the 2010 parliamentary elections than he had in 2009. In 2009, the elections were run by the Independent Election Commission, all 7 members appointed by Karzai, and they were the people who, in every instance, they and their staff either committed the fraud or cooperated with those who committed the fraud or knew of the fraud and covered it up. What should have happened is we should have said there should be a genuinely independent election commission with no Karzai appointees. But in 2009, there was a separate body called the Electoral Complaints Commission, which had 5 independently appointed members set up under Afghan law, 3 appointed by the UN, 1 by the Supreme Court, and 1 by the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission. And eventually, they removed enough fraudulent Karzai ballots to force a second round, although they didn't address all the fraud by any means. Karzai, in February, issued a decree giving him the power to appoint all 5 members of the Electoral Complaints Commission in violation of Afghanistan's constitution. The parliament twice rejected it. And yet that decree stands with a supposedly face-saving compromise with the UN appointing 2 members who have a veto. But it's a meaningless veto because the only action the commission can take is to throw out fraudulent ballots. And so if you veto a decision to throw out fraudulent ballots, the fraudulent ballots stand. In effect, and plus Karzai stripped the commission of its powers. So in effect, he's now in control of the entire electoral machinery. He wants to get rid of the parliament, the current parliament, because it is controlled by the opposition. It is the place in the country where the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks have power. So what's going to happen? We have a fraudulent parliamentary election, and what this will not be accepted by those communities. It risks civil war of the kind that took place in the 1990s that paved the way for the Taliban to take power. And so what we now have is a war that is being fought strictly between Pashtuns. It's basically a Pashtun civil war. Taliban, who may be 15 or 20% of the Afghan people, but since it's entirely Pashtun, what it would mean is they are 40% of the Pashtuns support the Taliban. Probably a fewer percentage support the government, but most of them don't like either. And that's the problem we're dealing with. It could be compounded now to be a civil war between the Pashtuns on the one side and these other communities who are half the country in the other. And why? This is basically Karzai's unchecked ambitions about which we are doing nothing. In fact, the administration took a tactical decision that it wasn't going to object to Karzai's takeover of the electoral machinery because it didn't want to upset the love offensive that they had this spring. But it's very short term because we'll pay the piper in September. I think we do have an obligation to the Afghans. And what happened in the 90s was terrible. A great deal of it goes back to what we did in the 80s. When we in the Reagan years did not behave like a great power. We supported an incredible, brutal thug, Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, who we described as a great patriot, who Islamicized Pakistan, and we allowed him to choose which Afghan groups got our money. And so we put in these Salafi fundamentalist groups into Afghanistan. And so, yes, we should feel some guilt, not so much for abandoning Afghanistan after '89, but for the kind of people that we supported and who then are responsible for the civil war.
Okay.
That's why I would keep troops there. Finally, the implications for Pakistan of a withdrawal or a reduction. Well, the first point I would make is that the Taliban cannot win in Afghanistan. The circumstances in the 90s were peculiar. They rode in on Pakistani tanks. So in some sense, it's a true quagmire. We can't win, they can't win. They cannot take the non-Pashtun parts of the country. They cannot take Kabul. Pakistan is a huge player in Afghanistan, partly because of the influence with their fellow Pashtuns. But the Pashtun community, which is half of Afghanistan, is only 15% of Pakistan. And so Afghanistan is not such an important factor in Pakistan. It's important, but it's not parallel. And so our reduction is not, if we reduce the number of troops we have in Afghanistan, it's not going to dramatically change the situation with regard to Pakistan, which is indeed genuinely important.
Okay, let's take 2 questions and comments, and I'll ask both our speakers to wrap up in response to them. There's 3 hands very bigly in the air, so let's take the gentleman in the middle here, and then the 2 hands at the back of the room, and I'll ask our speakers to sum up on that basis. Can we get the microphones? The gentleman in the middle of the room here. And 2 at the back. Please stand up.
So 2 questions for Michael Hanlon. I'm Juan Cole. We debated a couple weeks ago. I'm not stalking you. But you said that we have a strong coalition.